Hello and welcome to this geography lesson. Today we're going to have a look at the factors that influencing South Africa's climate, and we're going to look at anticyclones. Now, what makes South Africa different from other countries? We have certain factors that plays a huge role on our climate. The first one is ocean currents. Now, South Africa is surrounded by oceans. So immediately we experience two different types of climates. The first climate that we experience is maritime climate. Now what is maritime climate? It's any place that's situated next to the coast. Now what maritime climate does, it kind of moderates the temperature. The reason why is because the coastal line is surrounded, it's basically on, the water edges onto it. It means the temperature is moderated. It means the ocean kind of cools it down, but in the same time, it doesn't make it as warm as inland climates, because during nighttime, what does the water do? Releases its heat much slower. Then, in the interior of South Africa, we experience continental climate. Now, as you can see, continental climates is places that's not surrounded by oceans. Now, in South Africa, we experience both. Because South Africa is situated and we are surrounded by oceans, so in the interior of South Africa, we experience continental climate, and down at the coastal regions, we experience maritime climate. And we're going to have a look at the direct impact these ocean currents have on South Africa. Now, if we look at our next slide, showing a map of Southern Africa, you can see, first of all, the east coast of Southern Africa. Oops, let me just try and correct this. The east coast of Southern Africa is being washed by a warm Mozambican current, as you can see over here. The reason why it's a warm current is because this water comes from the tropical regions that's very close to the equator. Now why is it warmer at the equator? Because of the insolation it receives. If you move into that direction, temperature increases, and if you move away from the equator, temperature decreases. And this is the case that we experience on the west coast of Southern Africa. The west coast is being washed by a cold ocean current known as the cold Benguela current. Where does this water come from? From the polar regions, the south polar regions. Now these ocean currents create conditions that follows. It creates warm, moist conditions on the east coast, and it creates cool, dry conditions on the west coast. Now, I'm going to use the example, two places that's situated almost on the same degree of latitude. And it's a very popular example that we use in geography. It's Durban and Port Nolloth. As you can see, there's Durban and there's Port Nolloth. They are roughly on the same degree of latitude. So in theory, both of them should experience the same type of temperature, but they don't. For instance, during summer, Durban will experience a maximum temperature of 27 degrees Celsius and a minimum of 22 degrees Celsius. Where Port Nolloth will experience a maximum temperature on the same day, a maximum temperature of 22 degrees Celsius and a minimum of 18 degrees Celsius. Now to calculate the temperature range, what do one do? You take your highest temperature and you subtract your lowest for the day. So the temperature range for Port Nolloth is 4 degrees Celsius. Temperature range for Durban is what? 5 degrees Celsius. So very much similar, but there's a difference in the temperature itself. Durban experienced much warmer temperatures than Port Nolloth. Simple reason why is because Durban, the coastline, is being washed by a warm ocean current, and Port Nolloth, the ocean that flows past, is a cold ocean current. Now, while we're sitting with this map in front of us, I want to concentrate on Bloemfontein, right here in the interior of South Africa. Now, let's assume this is February. Like I've mentioned, a high temperature of 27 degrees Celsius for Durban and a minimum temperature of 22. Now, am I right when I'm saying we can establish that Port Nolloth and Durban experience maritime climate? Why do they experience maritime climate? Because they are situated next to the coastline and they are influenced by the ocean currents that flow past them. In the case of Port Nolloth, lower temperatures because of the cold Benguela current, it creates cool and dry conditions. And Durban, for example, situated next to the Mozambique current, creating very warm and moist conditions. But if we look at Bloemfontein, am I right that we can say Bloemfontein is continental climate? Now, Bloemfontein, on the same day where Durban experienced 27 degrees Celsius and a minimum of 22 degrees Celsius, what happens? Bloemfontein experienced a high temperature of 32 degrees Celsius and a minimum temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. Now, if we look at the temperature range, it's absolutely massive with continental climate. The temperature range, how do we get it? You take the highest temperature, you subtract the lowest temperature. In this case, the temperature range is 22 degrees. Look at the difference between Port Nolloth's temperature range, Durban's temperature range, and Bloemfontein's temperature range. Almost 18 degrees difference. The simple reason is, like we've mentioned before, the ocean regulates the temperature. When Bloemfontein, what happens? The land surface heats up. And during nighttime, what happens? We experience terrestrial radiation. The Earth releases heat and eventually temperature will drop. Whereas in Port Nolloth and Durban, because of the coastline, because of the ocean, what happens? The water takes much longer to heat up. And during nighttime, it releases its heat much slower. So that's the reason why we experience such a big difference between temperature range between continental climate and maritime climate. And most importantly over here, the influence that a cold ocean current and a warm ocean current have on the same place, on the same degree of latitude, but difference in temperature because of the water temperature. Now, if we continue at the second factor that plays a huge role in South Africa's climate, as you can see, let's just quickly recap on the ocean currents. The warm Mozambique current, it flows along the east coast. It creates very much warm conditions and moist conditions, and it results in rainfall. Now, if the cold Benguela current flows along the west coast, we already established it creates the cool and dry conditions and results in cooler conditions and less rainfall. Now, all around the world, if you look at your major desert areas, you usually find them on the west coast of continents. The reason why is because that coastline is being washed by a cold ocean current. Now, if you look at the Namib Desert in Namibia, it's because of this cold Benguela current. If you look at the Sahara Desert, also on the west coast of a continent. And if you move to the Americas, where Las Vegas is, also on the west coast of the continent, And the reason why is because of the cold ocean currents that flow past it. Now, this is a map showing the effect of temperatures between Durban and Port Nolloth, for example. If you look at your keys, showing you the different temperatures, as you can see, Port Nolloth situated over there. There's the key that's being indicated over there. Temperatures, average temperatures of 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius. If you look at Durban, over there, the key that indicates this key over here, experience high temperatures of 22.5 up to 27.5 degrees Celsius. And like I've mentioned before, look at Bloemfontein, inland climates, much higher temperatures, especially over here. Look at it, surpasses 27.5 degrees Celsius. And that's the huge impact these ocean currents have on the west coastline of South Africa and the eastern coastline of South Africa. Now, unfortunately, South Africa experience different rainfall regions. I always say when we look at South Africa, we've got great climate, we've got different climatic regions, but one thing that we are short of is rain. And because of these ocean currents, as you can see, our rainfall decrease from the east to the west. This area over here experience adequate rainfall during the year. The reason why is because of the warm Mozambican current. Because what does it do? It creates warm, moist conditions. And the Benguela current that we find on the west coast creates dry, cool conditions. Now, this warm, moist conditions, obviously, if it's creating warm, moist conditions, for instance, during summer, what type of pressure do you think we experience over the interior of Southern Africa? It's hot, we experience a low pressure. Now, this warm, moist conditions, I mean, the air, what does warm air do? It rises, but there's a lot of moisture that we have. And when this moist air rises, what happens? It cools, condenses, and we experience cloud formation and a high possibility of rain. Unfortunately, on the west coast of Southern Africa, it's cool and dry conditions. So there's not a lot of moisture content, but even though it may be summer, the air may rise, but there's no condensation taking place. Why? Because the air is very much dry. Now, our next factor that plays a huge role on South Africa's climate is the impact of the plateau. Now, first of all, let's just quickly define plateau. It's a flat area on a higher altitude. And altitude means height above sea level. Now, obviously, when you're down at the coast and you're sitting with your with your feet in the sand, you're basically 0 degrees above sea level because the sea is right next to you. And as soon as you go up, there's altitude. Now, believe it or not, I want to go back to the previous diagram. This is what South Africa looks like. In reality, if we had to go and draw a cross-section from the west coast to the east coast in South Africa, this is what the cross-section will look like. And let's use, because we're familiar with Durban and Port Nolloth, let's quickly fill this in. There's Port Nolloth, and there's Durban. And if you live in the interior, perhaps you're living in Johannesburg, this is where Johannesburg is. Believe it or not, when your friends tell you, listen, or your family members tell you, we're going down to Durban, we're going down to Cape Town. And in fact, they're actually speaking the truth, they're telling the truth. Because they're driving down to Durban, they're driving down to Cape Town. Johannesburg is 1,600 meters above sea level. Whereas you're down in Durban, is 0 meters above sea level. And this have a huge impact on South Africa's climate. Now, Port Nolloth, the rule of thumb goes as following. For every single 100 meters you increase with altitude, the temperature decrease by 1 degree. So that means for every single 100 meters we go up in altitude, the temperature decrease with 1 degree. It's logical. Now let's say, for instance, me and you, we go and climb Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa. What's going to happen as soon as we increase the altitude, once we get to the peak of Kilimanjaro? We're going to be dressed very warmly, and it's going to be extremely cold. There might be snow on top of that mountain, because the higher we go, how colder it gets. But now, my biggest question to you is, if Johannesburg is 1,600 meters above sea level, and Durban experiences a maximum temperature of 25 degrees, how is it possible that Johannesburg experience warmer conditions? In fact, if you think about it, if that's the rule of thumb, Johannesburg is supposed to be 16 degrees colder than Durban. But are we? During summer months, Johannesburg experiences warmer conditions to Durban. So if we follow this formula, for every 100 meters, the temperature drops by a degree Celsius, Johannesburg should only be, in theory, 11 degrees Celsius, but we're not. We're going to continue after the break and see if we can figure out this question.